Welcome to the Stronger Caribbean Together podcast. This podcast is a monthly conversation between the project team of Stronger Caribbean Together and Caribbean partners working on the front lines. I'm Kristinia Doughorty, a research assistant supporting the Stronger Caribbean project.
And I'm Dr. André Habet, a researcher in the area of rhetoric and a journalist. Every month, we'll bring you a conversation that shows how collectives are mobilizing to alter present systems and generate liberatory futures for the people of the Caribbean.
Our first season provides insights into the ways those people are confronting the challenges of disaster capitalism as people across the Caribbean stand together, united against disaster capitalism.
Today, we are joined by John Mussington of the Save Barbuda movement and Caton and Valentine Douglas from the Grenada Land Actors.
During this discussion, we spoke about how they became familiar with the concept of disaster capitalism, some of the fundamental issues that enable disaster capitalism as the main-state response to disaster, and what networks like Stronger Caribbean Together provide to local grassroots mobilizing. Our guests also talk through how we may rethink the language and meaning of development in the Caribbean. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. Can you all introduce yourselves?
My name is John Mussington. I am Barbudan from the nation of Antigua and Barbuda. Presently, I am also an elected member of council and I've just retired as a school principal.
I'm Valentine Douglas. I'm the president of the Grenada Land Actors. My career has not been in environmental matters. I have a background as a certified public accountant. I am retired now. I worked most of my life in the United States, and I was involved in investigation and prosecution of major financial crimes and public corruption in New York. Since I've retired, I've been back here for 4.5 years. I've always had an interest in the environment, even though it was not my first calling, but that interest continued on my return.
My name is Caton. I was born in Carriacou, Grenada, which is a 12.5 square mile little island, analogous to the size of Barbuda to Antigua. As a child, I was always planting flowers and planting trees and just enjoying being in woods. Well, the first year of my life I spent in St. George's, Grenada, because my dad was a carpenter and that was the only job he was able to find, was working in Grenada. I moved back to Carriacou. I left when I was 10 to come to Brooklyn, New York. I currently reside and have resided in Albany, New York for the past 27 years.
We started our conversation by asking John, Valentine, and Aaron about how they got involved with their respective organizations.
What we learned is that each person became activated by a different encounter that made them engage in the work ahead.
Now, my involvement in terms of the activities in Barbuda started with the disaster of 2017 when we were devastated by a hurricane. But shortly thereafter, our island and our people discovered what disaster capitalism meant. We were evacuated from the island because another hurricane was in the area. But then we found it strange that that hurricane didn't actually hit, but we found ourselves under mandatory evacuation and state of emergency in the sister island of Antigua and could not get back to Barbuda. And so later on, we realized that the entire island was to be redeveloped by private into logged real estate lots for sale. So since then, I've been involved with the people of Barbuda. We formed a movement, Save Barbuda, in collaboration with other organizations, national. And slowly we realized that this business of disaster capital was something that was taking place throughout the region. And so my involvement was out of necessity, because as Barbudans, we essentially refused to be deracinated. And that term deracination and was actually used on us. We were called imbecile when we started to resist what was happening to us. And later on, when we realized what that word, we essentially galvanized ourselves into a loose movement in order to essentially say, no, we refuse to bow down.
Grenada Land Actors was a group that I came across who was advocating for a land use, proper land governance in Grenada through a process of transparency and accountability. The organization was at the time primarily concerned with a number of major developments that were happening on island, and whether or not the government, through its lack of proper oversight, was given permits that would, to the developers, that would adversely affect our natural habitats, ecosystem, and environment as a whole. So I joined in, I think, in the beginning of 2021, and I've been involved with them since. And as we'll talk about later on, once the government tried to obstruct our action in getting information that the public is authorized to have, and that the government itself is not enacting regulation and unenforcing those that exist in matters of development, we decide to take the matter to court for judicial review.
What drew me to becoming involved with the Grenada Land Actors is a sense of profound loss and disappointment. I say this because in 1979, National Geographic came down to the Caribbean and they did a write-up on both St. Vincent and its Grenadines, Carriacou, all the way down to Grenada, including pictures of a nascent and story about the New Jewel movement, which is where Maurice Bishop was involved in. In that article, which came out in publication September 1979, my father is in that issue of National Geographic magazine. Well, what the book was National Geographic, but it was a hardcover book where they came to the Caribbean. They came all the way from Dominica to the end of Point Salines in Grenada, documenting the way of life, the simplicity of how our people live. You could see the transition now from 1966 to 1979, how not only the landscape changed where houses, buildings, hotels, offices were constructed, but just feel a difference in how the people look. The smiles disappeared between those ensuing 15, 16 years. And as I continue to go back home, I have realized that our people have become less happy because they have lost something. And I'm not even sure they know what they've lost. And that is the reason why I felt a call to environmental activism and protectionism.
Naomi Klein first coined disaster capitalism in her 2007 book, The Shock Doctrine, describing it as what occurs in the wake of major destabilizing events such as war, government upheaval, and natural hazards. In the Caribbean, disaster capitalism has occurred in response to hurricanes, as in the case of Barbuda, or the upheaval that Grenada faced, where the government prioritized investor interests over the well-being of Grenadians and their environment.
We asked our guests just how they experience disaster capitalism in their territories. What we learned is that disaster capitalism has a pattern of forcibly separating Caribbean people from the lands they rely on for food, shelter, and recreation, and providing access to those territories to foreign investors for profit. In Barbuda, that occurred after Hurricane Maria, while Grenadians experienced it through the Citizenship by Investment program Valentine discusses.
You have to live it to feel it. You have places in this world that can only be described as paradises. The nature, sources, the land, sea, all of that. And linked to that, you have the people and the culture and the way they live. So all that is part of who they are. So under normal circumstances, you would find it very difficult to disconnect people from those resources. And what this disaster capitalism is all about is persons who wish to use those resources to convert into dollars and cents to be extracted elsewhere. That is the sort of capital we face. And so it is an opportunistic approach where persons use a disaster, use our time in persons' life where they're under stress, where they may not be thinking straight, and they use that opportunity to extract wealth from the resources of a place. So in the case of Barbuda, we have a very unique history and culture in that the island during the period of slavery was leased to an English, the Codringtons. And the Codringtons had plantations in Antigua, Barbados, throughout the region. And so Barbuda essentially did not have sugar plantations. So it did not have the kind of production that the other colonies have. But what it did have was extensive resources where fish, meat, salt, and those sorts of things could be exported elsewhere. And so our history from a people who were accustomed to be connected to the resources, because unlike the other plantation where you had what we call in Antigua the nigger house, the communal living where all slaves were packed in, we didn't have that situation in Barbuda. So we were pretty much left to ourselves without having the enslavers having to look about our welfare because we couldn't live off the land. So when slavery ended, we continued that tradition which we brought from Africa. And so common ownership. And so Barbuda in 2007, we actually translated into legislation that whole concept of common ownership of our land. And what that does is that every single Barbudan is entitled to an equal share of the land, which represents the resource. What disaster capitalism is all about is that it took a hurricane where the entire island was evacuated and then first made that decision in the absence of the people owned the resource, made a decision, redevelop entire island and create a luxury real estate market where lots of land, the resources and the beauty that it represents could be sold for dollars. And so we have companies which are calling themselves Paradise Found. We have another one which is called Love and Happiness. So at our expense, we be deracinated, in other words, uprooted culturally, disconnected from the land. Others intend to benefit, monetize, and to enjoy the paradise which was ours.
In Grenada, our experience is similar to what John was saying, in that we have these sort of natural resources that are enjoyed by our community there. We have, particularly on the east coast of the island, a lot of coves and inlets, which are sort of incubators for fish stock. We have natural mangroves, which are filtration system and barriers to sea level rise. We have crabbing. We have a lot of things that communities depend on for their livelihood. Disaster capitalism is not a consequence so much what we're experiencing of a natural disaster, but it's a lot of capitalist actions that would lead to disasters, some of which we perceive to be maybe permanent. In Grenada, they have what they call the CBI program, the Citizenship by Investment program. And that program allows foreigners to get citizenship, that is, purchase a Grenada pass by either making a contribution to the Grenada Treasury or to invest in real estate in Grenada. Now, what that program has led to in Grenada is a wave of so-called investors running into Grenada because it's an opportunity for them to run out with great profit. And what they're doing, in fact, is looking at our prime areas that have served the community well. People go for their own recreation and other social activity. And these areas are being totally destroyed with government approval. Currently, we have some issues that are rising where people cannot get access to some beaches anymore because of sea level rise, because of mangrove destruction, and other things. And what one form of socialization now has been river fest. And people, obviously, if you squeeze them one way, they would have to move to another area. And this adjustment now to have these fest parties, soca dance, and all of these things in the rivers, on the banks of the rivers, is causing major pollution. We have other problems that would affect our local communities regarding water resource. Every year, our water agency, NAWASA, goes through a spell where they would ration water, and they don't have a good system of harvesting water in Grenada. So if you have a development of a 500-room hotel on a golf course in the north of the island, how are you going to get water to service that? Salination plant cannot deal with those issues. The loss of the beaches is one. The loss of livelihood to people's ability to get fish, to sell the fish, and then people who depend on their livelihood in near-shore fishing would lose that completely. How Grenada can be at a point where our fish stock is so depleted that people may not be able to afford that basic food. We already import tons of meat every year. We have a lot of issues when these developers come in now, and destroy the very fabric of our society, the environment that provides the area for their socialization and recreation.
The disaster in Grenada is not a natural occurrence. For me, it's a occurrence and as a result of poor fiscal management, whereby governments, small, tiny, developing states have bloated bureaucracies, no-bid contracts, crony capitalisms, budget deficits, IMF, World Bank, high interest rates. So there now needs to have an influx of revenue into the treasury. One of the words that I have come to really dislike and hate, and we use it a lot in the Caribbean, is development. What is development to another person is a disaster to us.
I've reached stage as well now that I have a name for it. I call it anti-development.
It is. The other word that goes along is investor. What those people do, they come from Asia, America, Europe, Africa. To me, they're dentists, right? They extract. They are coming to take something that they see as their right with our leaders' complicity to deprive, because they're building something, but they're not building those structures for people who look like us. We don't speak their language, we don't eat their food, they don't even come to our restaurants. We just have a different way about us completely. This 500-room hotel, which is in La Vera, it is the largest, flattest space on the north part of Grenada. Grenada itself, is relatively small. It's about 133 square miles with all little tiny islands included. Grenada is 120 square miles proper. And this La Vera project cedes 2% of Grenada's landmass for an indefinite period of time to the China Railroad Company. This company, as the name would imply, is from China, employs Chinese workers, but more than the workers. Right? They are taking something away from Grenadians that are rightfully ours. We cannot go to China and say we want to buy 1 acre of land. They don't allow it. They come with big trucks that are not rated for our roads, overfilled with gravel, concrete, cement. They don't care if the bridges are cracked or destroyed. All they want to know is that those structures are built in the name of development. There is a myopia that happens that prevents us from standing up to not even permit the first one to come. Because once they come, they are going to tell others to say, hey, this is easy pickings. So I don't know if it's how we have been socialized, indoctrinated, bamboozled, but we tend to think people who don't look like us are the ones who are going to save us. And that, to me, is the mentality that has to change in order for us to truly gain our independence. We, as Caribbean people, need to stop relying on the goodwill of others to empower our own people.
With the increased desire from foreign interest in the Caribbean, even protected areas have become a target for potential exploitation. John and Valentine discuss how Ramsar sites, wetlands considered by the Convention on Wetlands to be of international importance, have been encroached upon by development interest, going so far as to redraw the lines of these sites to accommodate investor interest and concessions that see Caribbean states foregoing significant potential tax revenue.
Another word for investor is wealth extract. And this mindset where we believe persons are going to come to develop us, it does not happen. And I think in the Caribbean, there's a lot of consciousness because with the situation with Barbuda, and there are lots of parallels with what you're talking about in Grenada and the other islands as well. The CIP programs, the changing of the system of the culture in terms of people making livelihoods and just taking it away. So for example, I'm sure in Grenada, some of those areas, we had sufficient sense to protect them. In the case of Barbuda, the 500 properties which they hope to develop, most of it is in the middle of a Ramsar site. We had the foresight to know how valuable these areas are. And so they're protected as national parks. And this particular area in Barbuda has been designated a Ramsar site. And everything that you have said in terms of the resources and the connectedness to people, the crabbing, the fishing, the coral reefs, right now we are facing situations where the properties are taken up 10-foot chain link fences are going up, military style security, and slowly but surely we are being fenced out of the coastal areas, our beaches, our shorefront, our seas, which are such an integral part to our lives and livelihoods, our culture. That is being taken from us. Many of us have been conscious in terms of trying to protect these areas under our laws as national parks and so on. But the thing about disaster capitalism is that all that is now being ignored. And you're finding areas which are specially protected because of the sensitive ecosystem. They're no longer off limits to these wealth extractors, which are engaging in anti-development, that call themselves developers and investors.
On the matter of the protected area Ramsar site, this is one of the issues that we are fighting in court. The developers at Lavera, it's on a Ramsar site, and they have sort of redrawn the lines for their convenience of setting up their golf course and hotel resort. On Aaron point briefly about the financial disaster that we are going to be experiencing. Number one, we have the government take $100 million loan to have the Chinese upgrade the airport in furtherance of the tourism product that is these new developments that coming on board. Now, the Chinese giving them the loan of $100 million, we have no way of knowing how we're going to pay back that $100 million. Chinese has a record of how they collect the loan in Africa and other places where they invest. Added to that, I just want to emphasize the part that all of these projects are being financed basically by our most precious resource, our citizenship, the sale of our passport. These people don't have to get a loan from anybody. More than that, they are granted concession for every nail to every piece of shelving they do on these resorts and developing this resort. So we are foregoing probably hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenue that we should have collected into concessions for these developers. So here is where our financial disaster lays. Concession that is granted to these people, we finance in the operation, and we take in loans from them that we don't know how we're going to repay.
That's very interesting, because behind the whole veneer of coming to develop and as investors is exactly what you're saying, Valentine. When you look at the agreements and the leases that are given to these operators, because when you consider the concession under the leases, the arrangement, the tax holidays, we are essentially not benefiting. And added to the whole situation is a case where the resources are depleted. And so those ecosystem functions, as they call it, the protection from storms, the livelihoods that are supported, we will no longer be able to benefit from those. So we lose on every front.
Looking then at what development should be, our guests offered their perspectives on an approach that centers people's well-being.
For Barbuda, development has to be sustainable, and development is defined as the conditions of life, livelihoods, your ability to live at a particular standard, and it has to be sustainable in the sense that the way we live from the resources presently without depleting them, we are guaranteeing that our children and grandchildren will be able to make a living and enjoy a quality of life up to particularly high standard from those same resources. That's what sustainable development is like. Now, in Barbuda, we have made steps since the early 90s to guarantee that. And that is why a third of the island essentially is a national park and declared Ramsar site, because how we are as Barbudans and how we live and how we identify is linked to our mangroves, our marine life, the livelihoods that we derive from them. And so we were charting the course in order to use those assets sustainably to continue our culture and our living. So that is what development looks like. We are now faced with a situation where others see different, and others would tend to create golf courses and luxury residences in exclusive lifestyle resort and enclaves. And that's how and that's diametrically opposed to what we view as our development.
The concept of development is one that is imported from the concrete jungles. We're hearing stories from developers saying, oh, you guys going to like it. It's going to be Dubai. We are not Dubai. We're not aspiring to be Dubai. We don't want to be anything that is like Dubai. So their concept of development is a playground for the rich, similar to what they did to Cuba during Batista era. And we do not see that. Unfortunately, our government has focused almost exclusively on tourism as the way to develop. We tend to ignore things, our best natural resource, our ability to feed ourselves, our ability to produce viable employment for our population. And if the emphasis is on tourism, we have an ecosystem that is just ideal for the ecotour. We have areas where you can have 10-room lodge that you can put in every parish in Grenada. We have scores of them in each parish. We have waterfalls and all sort of natural landscapes that would be attractive. We believe that by dispersing these small eco lodge, it would be almost like a large home in any of the parish, and that you do not put a stress on the system, and yet still the local economy that is within that parish would all benefit, instead of having these mega concrete jungles, an area where people come into all-inclusive treatment. We do not see that. We completely disagree with that method of development, contrary to what our Ministry of Tourism, our government perceive as development and what is being marketed. We are advocating strongly for a sustainable, a responsible development, where you do it in harmony with nature, that people can still come and enjoy the wildlife.
We need to educate our population. We need to have a more comprehensive health care. And from those two things alone, we will have and maintain dignity to go anywhere around the world. I believe the Caribbean region needs to incorporate more of a socialist model of development where we take care of each other. The governments provide increased safety nets, where we need to have less reliance on materialism, where we could see what Mr. Smith has and Miss Jones have, and we say, I want that too, at the expense of preventing even our own descendants from being able to achieve the same by not following the laws, not following a common sense of decency, not respecting the environment, and also not thinking sustainably.
John, Valentine, and Aaron also offered some insights as to why building regional solidarity through groups like Stronger Caribbean Together is a vital aspect of their campaigns.
Our biggest power is sharing awareness. If I don't know what is happening in Grenada, in Belize, in St. Lucia, and the same thing is happening to me, I would not be able to respond to it effectively. So our strength lies in sharing the knowledge and cooperating, working together against these challenges.
I totally agree with John here. We have to create that total awareness through the Caribbean. We tend to be very, very, very insular. And it seems as though because of our insularity, we have other issues in forming sort of this regional solidarity, in that the political aspect of it, once you form an organization or you start addressing a matter of national issue, you get branded as anti-government. And so that obstacle is one that we all, in all the islands, have to overcome and establishing that. But we need the education, the awareness, and I think that getting together of all the islands and basically using it as a regional force to bring these issues out and to bring it out to international organization, because we can only achieve change when the pressure becomes international. Remember, these developers are coming from these large countries mostly, and then they come and they probably come with a certain brand. And if a hotel brand is going to come and exploit our situation, our government may not be willing to do that. But if we have that regional group exerting that pressure internationally, I think it might be the most effective way we have of dealing with that problem. Definitely, we need regional solidarity.
I believe that the nations of the Caribbean could do a better job when it comes to educational exchange. So, for example, if somebody there's a school in St. Lucia, there's no reason why we can't have teachers from Belize or Guyana coming between the different countries to just let us know a different way of thinking, of even maintaining the language. I know we used to speak Creole, my grandparents used to speak it in Grenada, to bring cultural elements back that once bounded us together, instead of getting together for a carnival, which is, I think, what we do a really good job at, is we get together to fest and not to think intellectually. And I hope I'm not offending anybody by saying that, but I would like to see the same fervor of let's meet for workshops like this. And let's have a convention in Nassau, Bahamas with 1,000 Caribbean people to figure out and chart a way forward in a concise, cohesive, intellectual manner.
As our conversation with John, Valentine, and Aaron ended, they each emphasized the significance of the present moment to stave off what Valentine calls the domestic extinction of the Caribbean. As John puts it here, this has occurred as the loss of intact ecologies in other countries have driven up demand for places that still have environments in relative prosperity.
We must come to the realization that with all that is happening on planet Earth today with the climate crisis, we are living in these parts of planet Earth that can be considered the last bits of paradise. And so we're going to be targets of those persons who corner a lot of money. They're going to see us as prized possessions. And we have to be very much aware of the value of the resources that we have. And we have to think about the future of our small islands, our small countries. And we have to think along the lines of making sure we can sustain them for future generations.
I see ourselves as small islands that are almost ready for domestic extinction because we are being sold out by our own politicians to, as John mentioned, those extractors of wealth. And if we continue on that path, we would find ourselves into a sort of social chaos where we'll be constantly fighting among ourselves for whatever limited resources are left, because the prime one would be gone in the hands of these mega so-called developers. And I'm really concerned that the generations that are to follow will never have the experience of enjoying a natural environment that I do now and that my forefathers did very well. So I think it's urgent that, and I would make an urgent appeal to everyone in the Caribbean, as John said, to protect our little pieces of paradise, because it will be destroyed if we continue along the path which we go.
Well, I'd like to thank you for enabling me to join this amazing discussion this morning. As we go forward, I think it is important that people of the Caribbean acquire, maintain a greater sense of dignity, where we do not have to take shortcuts to gain, whether it's material wealth, have what others have, and also to value what we have. We as people, we can't teach somebody else what to value when it's theirs. There needs to be an internal awareness that what I have is near to me, it's rare, and it could disappear. So we need to think about what our ancestors did 100 years ago when they were fighting for independence in the early 1900s from Britain, from France, from the Netherlands, to make sure their descendants maintain independence and dignity. And I wish that those who are coming behind us have that same sense of pride.
Thank you all very much for the time taken today for this conversation. I really feel like I learned a lot. So thanks for being willing to talk to us and share these insights with us.
Thanks again to John, Aaron, and Valentine for joining us, and thank you for listening to the Stronger Caribbean Together podcast.
To learn more about the work of the Save Barbuda movement and the Grenada Land Actors, visit our website, strongercaribbeantogether.org, where we feature regular updates from all our regional partners.
Also, be sure to follow us on Twitter at Caribe Together and on Facebook at Stronger Caribbean Together. And be sure to join André and I next month for another conversation demonstrating the everyday work done by people united against disaster capitalism.
Thanks to Alexander Evans for providing our theme song. This podcast was made possible by a grant from the Open Society Foundations.